recording. Please feel free to turn your camera off if you wish, and please make sure that you're muted until we reach the question and answer part of the session. So we'll start with a brief introduction to child liberation theology and then move into our discussion. You can put your questions in the chat or use the raised hand feature to let us know that you'd like to ask a question. So with that said, grab yourself something to drink and settle in. I will start by introducing myself. I'm Abby Nye, one of the co-founders of CFCtoo. I'm an abuse survivor, activist, and the oldest of 9 children in a quiverful family. CFCtoo exists in the context of the Church 2 movement. We've seen abuse exposed in a variety of denominations, SBC2, PCA2, ACNA2, and now we have CFCtoo. So CFCtoo is a coalition of abuse survivors from Christian Fellowship Center, which is an insular quiverful group that calls itself a church. We're a young advocacy group, just a year old, but we're passionate about providing a safe space for people who have escaped from CFC to tell their stories, to find support in a community of survivors, and to process the trauma that they've experienced inside CFC. So our discussion today is one of many events that we hope to have with different experts on topics that will support our survivors and their healing journeys. And I'm so pleased to have Ryan join us today because I've benefited personally from his work all the way back to the Homeschoolers Anonymous days. So to introduce Ryan Stollar is a child liberation theologian and an advocate for children and abuse survivors. The author of an upcoming book on child liberation theology called The Kingdom of Children. Ryan has an MHS in child protection from Nova Southeastern University and an MA in Eastern Classics from St. John's College. He has served on the board and run numerous social media campaigns for child advocacy organizations. Co-founder of the viral website Homeschoolers Anonymous, his advocacy work on behalf of homeschooled children and alumni has been featured in national and international media. Thank you so much for being here today, Ryan. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Abby. I appreciate the introduction and thank you for having me here. I really appreciate the invitation and thanks to everyone who has joined us live and thanks to everyone who will be watching later as well. Just to give you a quick overview, we'll be talking about child liberation theology today, and most of my talk will be focused on theology and then as well as positive changes we can make to our world to empower and liberate children. Of course, though, whenever we're talking about the topic of empowering and liberating children, that involves the questions of what are we liberating them from? And so this talk will touch on the issues of child abuse and neglect a little bit. So I just want to give you a heads up ahead of time. I won't discuss anything graphic in that regard, but if you do find those topics potentially triggering, please do make sure you take care of yourself as you are listening to the talk. Abby, is with the screen, everything looking okay still?
It looks okay to me.
Okay, cool. I am going to move forward then. So I wanted to begin with this quotation from Judith Gundry Wolfe from a book published by Marcia Bunge called The Child in Christian Thought. And I just really love this quotation. And so I wanted to share it with you to kind of set the stage for everything we're going to talk about today. And what I like about this quotation is for me, it really captures the truly radical nature of Jesus's approach to children. So the quotation is that Jesus did not just teach how to make an adult world kinder and more just for children. He taught the arrival of a social world in part defined by and organized around children. So I think that's a really important and powerful statement. And I think that reflects what I see when I read the Bible. I think that Jesus makes clear that, his kingdom, what he calls the kingdom of God, is not just one that treats children better than other contexts. It's a kingdom that he says literally belongs to children. And to me, that's pretty radical because I was raised in an evangelical Christian home. So, I was taught that children are evil from birth. And so a world led by children would be a lot like the Lord of the Flies, lawless and hellbent. But that's not Jesus's viewpoint. And so that is something that has intrigued and challenged me over the last few years, and something that I've tried to figure out. And that's what's been inspiring child liberation theology for me. So child liberation theology for me is my attempt to capture the radicalness of Jesus's approach to children. And so we'll talk about that today. Just to give you a little overview of what I'll discuss today, we'll start off just with an overview of what child liberation theology is, what makes it theology, what makes it liberation theology. We'll also talk about the things that led me to child liberation theology. So those moments in my life that have inspired me to want to explore this field. We'll talk about what it looks like to approach the Bible with the lens of child liberation theology. I'll talk a little bit about child liberation theology and child development. Whenever we talk about issues of liberating children, there's often the question of how do we do that in a way that does not force children into age inappropriate roles or responsibilities. And so I will address that a little bit today. We'll also talk about how child liberation theology can relate to the social and political rights of children. So, this isn't liberation theology, as I'll discuss in more in depth later, is meant to be something very practical, something that actually makes an impact on the world around us. And so child liberation theology likewise demands that we make real concrete changes to the lives of children. And then finally, we'll look at what it means to apply child liberation theology in everyday life, what it means to actually put that into practice. And then at the end, I'm totally open to answering any questions that anyone has. So let's start off with what child liberation theology is. And I think the best way to describe this is to kind of break it down into each of its words. So first of all, what is theology? Theology is the combination of two words. They're Greek words, theo and then logi. Theo means God and logi means study. So literally this is, when we're doing theology, we're studying God. And for Christians, Christian theology also extends to the study of the Bible, as the Bible is claimed to be the Word of God. So for Christians, the theology is the study of both the God and the Bible. Liberation theology is a specific type of theology. It was created by a Black American theologian, James Cone, as well as a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez. And liberation theology was born out of everyday struggles for marginalized people groups. Theology traditionally has been something that's based in, thoughts and thinking. So it involves people reading the Bible, sitting down, thinking about what they think the Bible says about God, and exploring that in kind of in an intellectual way. And throughout history, that often has been at the expense of, or the exclusion of, actually making a practical difference in the world around you. And so liberation theology is kind of a response to that tendency to over-intellectualize and not think about how we should apply our thoughts into the lives around us. So liberation theology is a way of studying God in the Bible, and it's specifically a way that is supposed to lead to a more just and equitable world. There are many different types of liberation theology. There are liberation theologies for just about any marginalized people group you can think of. So there's Black liberation theology, there's a liberation theology for people with disabilities, there's queer liberation theology. And each different type is about equipping and empowering that people group to be able to think about and talk about God and the Bible on their own terms and in a way that brings liberation to them. So child liberation theology is a specific form of liberation theology. It is a form that focuses on children and centers children. So this is a theology that is wanting to create a more just and equitable world, and it is specifically focused on children and the challenges and struggles that children face in their everyday lives, and thinking about how can we use God and the Bible in a way that empowers and helps children rather than abuses and controls them. And there's two parts to child liberation theology. There's the adult part, and then there's the child part. The adult part involves adults. So there's a lot of barriers in families and our faith communities that exclude children and keep them from being able to fully participate in the communities around them. And so there's a responsibility for us adults to think about the ways that we discriminate against children and treat them inappropriately. And so on one hand, child liberation theology is a challenge to adults to do better in the lives of the children around them. And then on the other hand, child liberation theology also is for children. So it ultimately belongs to children. And part of child liberation theology is the argument that children are fully human beings who are capable of understanding and engaging the world in their own unique age-appropriate ways. And so child liberation theology is not just something for adults, it's also for children, and it's invested in thinking about how can we let children take hold of this theology for themselves. Because ultimately we want children to be able to exercise their agency and to be able to engage God and the Bible on their own terms and to approach the God and the Bible with their own questions. So ultimately, child liberation theology is a theology of self-determination. So it's helping children to be able to engage the world in their own ways and on their own terms. So a little bit about what led me to child liberation theology. How did I get this idea? I did not come up with it by myself. There's a few paths that have led me to this field of study. The first was falling in love with liberation theology when I was in college. When I was in undergrad, a friend gave me a copy of Gustavo Gutierrez's book, A Theology of Liberation. As I mentioned earlier, Gutierrez is one of the founders of liberation theology. And when I read the book, I absolutely fell in love with it. And what I fell in love with was how invested it was in making a difference in the right here and the right now. I grew up in evangelicalism, and in evangelicalism, religion is often determined by having the correct beliefs and having the correct thoughts. Often that meant that evangelicals neglected to address the social and political suffering that was going on around them. And that really infuriated me. And I feel like beliefs, like good beliefs, should translate into good behavior. And so for me, liberation theology was kind of the answer to my question of if Christianity is true, then shouldn't it make a difference in our lives, in our everyday moments? And liberation theology for me was saying that yes, it should. I also was inspired to think about child liberation theology from my advocacy for homeschooled children and alumni. I was homeschooled from kindergarten through high school graduation in an evangelical Christian family. And while being homeschooled, my experience was relatively positive, but I did see a lot of abuse and neglect among my peers. And so when I became an adult, I decided that those stories of abuse and neglect deserve to be shared and heard. And so I created Homeschoolers Anonymous and several nonprofit organizations to advocate for homeschooled children and alumni who have experienced abuse and neglect. And while advocating for homeschooled children and alumni, I saw firsthand how Christianity can be used to abuse and control children. And that for me seems to contradict a lot of what is said in the Bible regarding how children should be treated, and especially how Jesus approached children. And so I was thinking that during those years when I was advocating for homeschool children and alumni, that there has to be a different way that we can approach God and the Bible that is not leading us to want to abuse or control children. There has to be some alternative. As I advocated for homeschool children and alumni, I realized I needed to be better equipped to do that work. I had a lot of passion for it, but I didn't have the necessary training. And so I went back to school and I got a master's in child protection. And it was during that master's, while I was studying what science has shown us are the best practices when it comes to child development and parenting and protecting children, empowering children, I just kept running up against the fact that so much of the evangelical parenting beliefs and practices that are promoted in the world that I grew up in, they directly contradict the best practices regarding children that I was learning in my master's program. So that really crystallized for me that there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way that we can engage God in the Bible. And so my mind, of course, went to liberation theology from my experience with it previously. And I thought, there has to be a child liberation theology. If there's liberation theologies for just about any people group you can think of, why would there not be one for children? And so that is what ultimately led me to this topic. And that is what has inspired my work for the last few years and has connected me with some wonderful folks, some of whom are in here with me today. Fellow child liberation theologians like Rebecca Stevens Walter. There are many people that are exploring this field and doing some really important work, and I am just honored to be doing that with them. So let's now talk a little bit about what it looks like to approach the Bible with a child liberation lens. So what does it look like to put this theology into action when we are actually engaging God and the Bible? Obviously, there's many, many different ways that we could apply this sort of a theology, but I'll just bring up three of the main ones for me. The first is that we really need to notice and center children in the biblical narratives. So, children are everywhere in the Bible, but often they're at the margins of the narratives in which they are featured. For me, the perfect example of this would be Naaman's enslaved servant girl in 2 Kings. In the story, Naaman has leprosy, and the servant girl suggests that he go to the prophet Elisha for healing. And that's the beginning of the story. This young girl who is enslaved, she speaks up. She's kind of the instigator of the whole story. And the whole story culminates in Elisha healing Naaman of his leprosy. And it ultimately has some significant impact on international politics at the time, this whole healing narrative. And it starts with this young girl, and then once the story starts to develop, she just disappears. We never hear what happens to her. We don't hear her voice ever again. And so for me, child liberation theology is a challenge to start to notice and identify these children in the Bible who are there, but are either just in a fleeting moment or actually excluded from most of the narrative. And so the starting place for me with child liberation theology is actually to pay attention to the children in the Bible and to notice their agency and their actions. The second way that I think that this should change how we approach God and the Bible is that we should be talking back to and reinterpreting biblical narratives when they appear to sanction child abuse. If Jesus truly reflects God, in my opinion, that means God must take child abuse seriously. Think about how significantly stern Jesus's warning is to those who harm children, the verse regarding millstones and being drowned in the ocean. I think that's a pretty strongly worded statement about the importance of protecting children to Jesus in his ministry. And so I think that means passages in the Bible that appear to sanction child abuse need to be wrestled with and not blithely accepted. And I think a perfect example of that is also from 2 Kings, also involves the prophet Elisha. That would be the story of Elisha and the 42 children. For those who are unfamiliar with that story, Elisha is walking along a road, and there's 42 young boys who are taunting the prophet because he is bald. And the prophet curses the children, and 2 bears show up and attack the children. Growing up evangelical, I was taught, and I know a lot of my friends were taught, that story was kind of a warning to us as children to not disrespect our elders, otherwise God might sick bears on us, which of course was a terrifying prospect, and is something that I think is pretty wrong to teach children. But it was a pretty common interpretation. And so I think that we need to be looking at those passages and be thinking about how can we actually be using those passages in a way that pushes back against the idea that child abuse is either good or necessary. And I think that wrestling is really important. I know to a lot of evangelicals that could sound sacrilegious, but to me, wrestling with God and the Bible is healthy. I think the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel or potentially God themselves, and Jacob is actually blessed for it. I think that indicates that it is okay to wrestle. It's actually a good and moral and sometimes a holy thing to do, to not just blithely accept what we're told is correct or true, but to actually do the work and research and figure out if that is actually going to edify our current context. Third, I think that we should be involving children and seeing them as co-explorers of the Bible. So child liberation theology, like I said earlier, it involves both adults and children, and involving children in the process is a vital and essential part of liberating children. And this involves adults seeing children as capable of providing insight and revelation, and capable of doing that in a way that is just as important and equal as adults. So when we approach the Bible with children, I'm not talking about simply reading them bedtime stories from the Bible when they're going to bed. What I'm talking about is seeing children as being capable of being prophets and theologians in their own right. I don't think that children should just be followers of adults when it comes to God and the Bible. I think children have their own relationship to God that should be nurtured and protected. And I don't think adults have the right to be interfering with that relationship. So that's just a little bit about what I think, how I think child liberation theology can be used when we're approaching God and the Bible. I do want to talk briefly about child development and child liberation theology, because a question that I frequently get whenever I talk about the topic of child liberation is, or a question or a challenge is often, how do we give children, the same freedoms, the same responsibilities as adults without forcing them to assume roles or responsibilities that are beyond their capabilities or their ability to cope with whatever it may be. So, how do we liberate children in age-appropriate ways without forcing them into adult roles or into having to be a parent rather than a child? Before I talk about this, I do want to be just explain that in the field of child liberation, so not just child liberation theology, but kind of the even broader field of, beyond religious-based child liberation, but more political child liberation. The topic of child development can be controversial. And this is because the actual field of child development, the people that make up the scientific researchers, they do tend to focus on children being not fully developed versions of adults. So a lot of child development is focused on the limitations of children and how they don't compare to adults. So they don't they're not that field is not focused so much on children as being fully human beings at every stage of their life with unique ways of viewing and interacting with the world. Instead of looking at the potentialities and the possibilities, a lot of it is focused more on like the negatives. So the ways that children are lacking. And so when we talk about child development, I just want to be clear that that's not what I am talking about. So I want to talk about two issues with child development. One is adultification. Adultification is viewing children as adults or forcing them into adult roles or responsibilities. This word, you'll most commonly encounter it in the context of racism, and that there's a phrase called adultification bias, and that refers to the fact that often white people, white adults, especially law enforcement, they will often view Black children or other children of color as being older than they are and interpreting that as being dangerous. So that's the most common way that we use adultification, but it does apply beyond that, just the field of racism as well. There are many different ways that adults can force children to assume responsibilities or roles that are beyond their what they should be. One of these would be parentification. So parentification is a form of adultifying children, and this is a very common form in quiverful families. Parentification is when parents in particular make a child take on roles or responsibilities that should be taken on by that adult's social, emotional, or romantic partner. So in many quiverful families, parents will force their children to take care of younger siblings, to run the household. There's often cases of what is called emotional incest, which is when often usually a father forces a daughter to listen to marital problems. So instead of adults dealing with their problems on their own or trying to work through their problem with their partner or anything like that, they force a child to bear the emotional brunt of those situations. So those are obviously the things that we want to avoid when we're talking about protecting and liberating children. When we, equip and empower children to be able to engage the world, engage the problems that they're going to face, and empower them to be able to adequately cope with the problems that they will face out in the world. We want to make sure that we do that in a way that is not forcing them to take on more than they are able at the time. And so for me, we avoid those, adultification and parentification by being students of child development and learning how to, rather than looking at the limitations of children, we ask, how do we best support a child at every stage of their life? And that could vary from child to child, of course. Every person is unique. And so our efforts to empower and equip and empower children need to be tailored to each child and how they best learn and thrive in their environments. I'll talk now about a little bit about child liberation theology and children's political and social rights. So how should this topic of child liberation theology impact our laws and other government policies? I want to talk about this specific issue. It may seem tangential, but it's actually pretty important. There are many types of theologies that deal with children. There's a field called child theology. There's a field called theology of children. These are all distinct fields, even though they have a lot of the same words. But there are numerous Christian movements to think about and better address how Christian faith communities interact with children. And child liberation theology, for me, is distinct from those other forms of child theology in that child liberation theology is very clear that children deserve to have social and political rights. And it's really important for me to advocate for children and advocate that they have social and political rights, because the United States, which is where I live, is the only country that is a member of the United Nations that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified by every single member nation. There were a couple holdouts. It was the United States and Somalia finally ratified it a few years ago. And so the US is now alone in not ratifying it. This is the most widely ratified treaty in all of world history, and the United States is the holdout. The reason we haven't ratified this convention is due to evangelical homeschoolers. So the very community that I grew up with, they have been very successful in lobbying against the US ratifying this convention. And the reason for that is that they believe that the convention is a threat to parental rights. And that's the final point I want to make here regarding child liberation theology and how it relates to policy, is that we need to be speaking forcefully against the growing parental rights movement, which is the movement that underlies the current opposition to the UN Convention. And the reason for this is that the growing movement that we're seeing right now surrounding the topic of parental rights, you'll see this topic when it comes to like issues like critical race theory in public schools or mask mandates in public schools. Over the last few years, I'm sure most everyone here has seen or heard more about parental rights. And at first glance, you might think, what's the problem? The government, you might think, doesn't own children. Parents have a responsibility for the children they bring into the world. And so the idea of parents being able to guide their children in the ways they think that they should might not strike you immediately as necessarily wrong. The issue is that for the folks that are driving this conversation, for the evangelicals, parental rights is a very specific concept that excludes any possibility of children having their own rights. So for evangelicals, parental rights means children, other than having the right to life, really don't have any other social and political rights. And for me, that's a very significant problem. And that's something that we for folks who are Christians and who are trying to figure out how we use God and the Bible in a way that empowers and liberates and protects children, we need to be very loud about the fact that children have their own rights, that they do not belong to either the government or parents, that they belong to themselves. And I think that that is a core truth, and that underlies a lot of child liberation theology, is the fact that children should have agency in their own lives. So let's talk a little bit about what this really looks like in everyday life. Child liberation theology is a liberation theology, and so it's not just about thinking about things. For us liberation theologians, it doesn't matter how fancy or complicated your theology is, if it's not causing you to go out into the world and get your hands dirty in actually fighting against the injustice and suffering that's around us, then that theology just isn't worth anything. And so that's the same with child liberation theology. If this theology is not actually inspiring us to go out and improve the world for children and help children seize their right to change the world for themselves in the ways they want, then this theology is not something that is worthwhile. So what are some tangible things that adults can do to apply the principles that I've been talking about in their own lives? The first is to treat children in your lives as more than extensions of their parents. And I think this point applies equally to both, children in your own family as well as children in other families. There's a very wonderful book. It's called Children in the Worshiping Community. It's by David Eng and Virginia Thomas. And the book is a very practical guide. It just has a bunch of different suggestions for how to better include and encourage participation from children in faith communities. So if you want just some great ideas on how to better involve children, it's a great book. But they have an excellent quotation in the book it's along the lines of this, that is, children are people, not puppies. You don't pat them on the head and say how cute they are. You shake their hand and find out what matters to them. And I think that that's a very important point. Children are not just extensions of their parents. They're not just meant to be, cute or funny accessories. They are their own human beings. They have their own needs and wants and thoughts. And one of the best ways we can respect children is to treat them as the human beings that they are, and extend the same respect and care and compassion that we would to adults to children. Another way we can apply the principles of this theology is to invest resources, so time and money and whatever else we have, in the lives of children around us. And I think this is a particularly good challenge to give to folks who do not have children, especially folks who are child-free, who specifically choose not to have children. Whether you have children or not, I think we should all be investing in the lives of the people around us, and that includes children. And so, whether you have children or not, I think we should all be engaged on the topic. I think we should be investing our time and our money in helping the lives of those around us, which include children. So, whether that's volunteering in a youth organization or donating money to a friend's child who needs therapy, or, buying meals for someone who just had a baby, I mean, there's lots of ways that we can be better engaged with children and families that have children using our resources. Finally, I think that we need to challenge the idea that parenting is about authority and control. The idea that parenting is about authority and control is really fundamental to evangelicalism, and especially to the quiverful ideology that has been promoted by people like Bill Gothard or Doug Phillips. And what I mean by parenting being about authority and control, let me give you an example. Some of you have seen this probably before. It's the umbrella of authority. So for many evangelical parenting teachers, authority is the foundation of their beliefs and practices when it comes to child rearing. In evangelicalism, the world in general is locked into a top-down hierarchical authoritarian structure. And so you can see that in this picture. So every person has their place in a line of authority. There's Jesus, of course, at the top in the pictures, and then sometimes there's pastors or the church underneath Jesus. Then you have a husband. The husband is in charge of the wife is in charge of the children, and so forth. In this top-down hierarchy, men are always on the top. Women and children are going to be in the lower positions because the system is patriarchal. So not just when it comes to families, but also just the world in general for evangelicals, they believe in this system of authority. And I think that deconstructing from that sort of worldview, like a high control environment like Quiverful or the evangelical homeschooling world I grew up in, like it definitely needs to involve rethinking and challenging this idea that authority and hierarchy are inherently good and inherently godly things. What I still find personally provocative about Jesus is the way that he challenged authority and hierarchy and questioned them when they caused vulnerable people groups to be treated wrongly. And so for me, like this is kind of at the heart of child liberation theology, is rethinking that idea of authority and hierarchy as being always good. Sometimes authority and those that are at the top of the hierarchy are not good people, they're abusive. And so we need to be equipping and empowering children, especially, to be able to speak up when those in power harm them. And the only way we're going to do that is by having families and faith communities where children actually feel free and welcomed to speak up about those sorts of situations. And so that's why, for me, child liberation theology is so vital, is because so much of Christianity has been used to abuse and control children. And so it's going to take a lot of work to stop doing that and move in the complete opposite direction of respecting children and respecting their agency and their voice and empowering them to be able to find those things and use them in the ways that they want to use them. That is the end of my presentation. I did want to mention I do have a book coming out in November on child liberation theology. It's called The Kingdom of Children. You can get it directly from my publisher, Eerdmans. You can also get it anywhere you get books. So Amazon or Barnes & Noble, they all have them. And then on the screen here, I do have my contact information. If you do have any thoughts or questions or want to connect on child liberation theology, feel free to email me. And then my website there, rlstollar.com. I do have an index on the front page that links to pretty much every writing that you can find currently on child liberation theology. So that includes not just my own writings, but writings from other wonderful people that are exploring this field, such as Rebecca Stevens-Walter, who is here with us today. So I will conclude by just thanking you all again for being here. And again, thank you to Abby and CFCtoo for having me. And I am open for some questions if we have time for that, Abby.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not kicking anybody off. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was a wonderful and thought-provoking introduction to something that I think is really important. So I wanted to say thank you. I will open it up for questions. Folks, yes, it looks like Rebecca has a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ryan, for this. How passionate I am about this work, and children's liberation theologians are the best colleagues.
Yes.
We're just doing, I think, maybe the most important work, and not that we're in the important work Olympics, but nonetheless. So I just want to thank you for the work that you do. And we come from very different backgrounds. I did not. Okay, good. I did not grow up evangelical. As you know, I grew up what I call evangelical adjacent. I'm from the American South, but in a very what would be called a very progressive context. But nonetheless, I had these experiences of childhood oppression because it's my feeling and my experience that child oppression is subversive across our society, that it's not just relegated to the evangelical world, although I think that may be where it stems from, and we could have that conversation. But I wonder if you could talk about the fact that we as a society oppress children. And I say that because I mean, I want you to talk about it because I actually think that it's important to recognize, like in my context, it's important to just to understand that it's not them, it's not these other people who are oppressing children, it's not these crazy evangelicals, but it's actually all of us. And we're all responsible, even folks who are child free, even folks whose children are grown, even folks, all those things. It's all of us who are complicit. It's all of us who, perpetuate this oppression. And so then it's also, and you said this, it's all of us who are responsible for addressing it. But anyway, can you talk about just the subversive nature of child oppression?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a book called Childism by Elizabeth Young Brule, and that is what that book first really like clued me into like the systemic nature of these issues. I do think that forces like adultism or childism, and those are would be words to describe like the systemic discrimination against and oppression of children and people based on age. I do think that those are universal, and that is something that we all, that is one of the reasons, as you said, why we all are responsible for getting involved in this kind of work. And when it comes to systemic issues, I think that this discrimination against and oppression of children is like any other systemic issue. So, we often talk about in like racism, like, is racism like one specific person being bigoted towards another person? Like, no, it's not. Everyone kind of everyone participates in, and not everyone, white people participate in and benefit from systems of racial discrimination and oppression, whether or not like we are racist towards an individual person. And so similarly, like, since our society is built in a way that discriminates against and oppresses children, I think all adults in one way or another are participating and benefiting from that systemic discrimination and oppression. I mean, children are, I know you, Rebecca, have argued the point that children are the most oppressed people group. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And one thing that points me in that direction is that children are seen still as like the one people group that it is entirely socially appropriate to own. It's still legal to hit children. So there are many aspects of our like legal system that need to be torn down to get to the root of the issues. And those have nothing to do with evangelicalism. That has to do with how our society in general does not treat less powerful people well, especially children. And I think that how we treat children as adults has ramifications too for all sorts of other people groups. Because at its core, when it comes to children and adults, it's a question of what is the appropriate way for someone with more power to interact with and treat someone with less power. And so the way we answer that when it comes to adults and children, if we allow for abuse or oppression or discrimination being appropriate in that relationship, that opens the door for that being okay or appropriate in any other context where you have a more powerful person and a less powerful person, which, as you can imagine, would be, there are many situations like that, and that would lead to has led to many devastating consequences. So just to touch on the evangelical point, I do think that it's really, really important when it comes to issues like child abuse and neglect, especially, that we don't think that the problems are out there. They're not. They're in our own communities. Anyone can be a child abuser. Like, child abusers don't really have one specific profile. They blend in really well. And so, most child abusers abuse people in their circle. So people that they know, children that they know. They're not evil people out there trying to trick our children into going into, a white cargo van. Instead, it's people in our communities that we trust who abuse that trust. And I do think that there is a tendency among progressives, liberals and progressives, to assume that some of these problems don't exist in our communities, and that's absolutely false. In fact, I generally bristle with, like, anytime there's a case of child abuse and it confirms our assumptions, like, oh, well, it's an evangelical preacher again, but it's not X, X being someone who's a liberal or progressive. I think that's really unhelpful, because even if like that whatever X is has not abused a kid yet, in a year, 2 years, there might be a story where that it does happen, and then that just destroys the whole veneer of us being better. And so when it comes to child protection, I think we need to be very clear that this is something that transcends political and social boundaries. Like, it's everywhere. Everywhere you're going to have children, you're going to find potential cases of child predators, because wherever the children are, that's where the predators want to be. So. Did that answer or
Yeah,
address how you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that you said that I found really extra compelling is that, this idea that liberals and progressives just kind of assume that it's out there. And that and a lot of times folks in the liberal and progressive world, and that's a big world and that's a very broad term, but nonetheless, those folks are coming from an evangelical world into those worlds, and so there's a little bit of like new discovery that happens, and a lot of assumptions that are made, and that like evil couldn't possibly exist here. And yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously that's a whole conversation in its own, but thank you for talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of points to something that would be helpful to say in this context of like CFCtoo and people that are leaving these high control environments, which is that there are people in liberal and progressive communities that know that language
Yes.
in and out, and they will use that to exploit and abuse someone that's fleeing.
Yes.
So I would stress, like, never assume that someone's safe just based on their belief system.
Or an institution.
Or an institution, yeah, or an institution. And like in that case, like, in general, I would say, like, every faith community should have a child protection policy. And well, I will say that, like, liberal and progressive faith communities tend to be more open to those things. They are at the same time often just as apathetic regarding like actually implementing it or following it.
Well, and they can be open to it and thinking that, like you said, because they have it, then now we're safe.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like, oh, we have a child protection policy. Well, but okay, have you, like, who knows about it? And do you talk about it? And to actually dig into the work of liberating children is really not comfortable work, and any human being, I think, would have a trouble wanting to do it without being pushed a little bit.
Definitely.
Ryan, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So we've we hear a lot about parental rights and sort of other things that are kind of discouraging. Perhaps where do you see some glimmers of hope in terms of people or organizations who are doing good work, perhaps states that are passing really good laws, or other things that we can kind of look at as perhaps things that we can emulate in other places?
Yes. In terms of what gives like me hope is seeing people that are leaving these high control environments like come out of that and start challenging those beliefs and practices that they inherited. I mean, there's a lot of people who are doing like really important and difficult work in deconstructing the parenting and child rearing ideas that they were inculcated with. And one person in particular stands out to me. That's Cindy Wong Brandt. Cindy runs the Raising Children Unfundamentalists Facebook group and the Parenting Forward Facebook page and movement. And there's a lot of folks associated with that. But to me, like that is what gives me hope, is seeing that people are doing that difficult work of breaking the cycles of abuse and being willing to say, like, I'm not willing to harm my child, even if the people around me are telling me to do that. You know, that takes a lot of bravery and courage, and I greatly admire that. So I think that looking at the kind of the unfundamentalist parenting movement can bring a lot of hope. In terms of government policy, I'll be honest, like I'm more worried on that front, because there is like the growing parental rights movement has been pretty successful in passing state constitutional amendments to enshrine parental rights. And so the flip side to me would be, what would be giving me hope would be people that are trying to protect the rights of children. And I think that there are groups doing that, like in homeschooling, there's the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. They have had several successful legislative battles, defeating laws that would put more children at risk of abuse and neglect. And I do think that there is getting to be more momentum surrounding like reporting child abuse in faith communities by clergy. And I know that's something that, you know, is CFCtoo has been working on and is very familiar with. But I do think that we're seeing more and more of those laws being proposed that would actually put children's needs and interests first and foremost. But I mean, I will say it can be a pretty, you know, discouraging field sometimes too, to work in. And part of that is that there's just, our society assumes that so much of adultism and childism is okay. So like Rebecca's saying, like the problems in the liberal and progressive communities, like I will hear, you know, language about children, like people referring to cruel or evil people as children, you know, like, oh, Donald Trump did X, Donald Trump is a child, that sort of comment. Like, but I think that there's starting to be like a change in that too. People are starting to speak up about that and challenge those uses of language and such. So I don't know, that didn't give you a lot of hope, but I think that we are starting to see like some big shifts in seeing children as fully human beings with their own voice, their own needs, their own rights, especially in the I feel like the child development field is finally starting to turn a corner in that regard, like with books like The Whole Brain Child, and others like that. I think that science is starting to reveal to us a lot more about children's capabilities and power rather than just their limitations. And I think that's actually a very encouraging and inspiring field, is seeing that what children can do. And for me, that gives me hope. Like, I have a lot of hope in what the next generation is going to do. At the same time, we also don't want to put all of our hope in the next generation. That's unfair to them. So we need to do the work too. So.
Any other questions?
I'll try one, if that's all right.
Go for it.
Hey, well, this was really great. It was awesome to learn more, to get a review of things. I was an early reader of the book, as Ryan's literary agent. Book is available for pre-order too, just so everybody knows. It's out in October. I have a background in psychology and religion, and I study identity, especially as it relates to religion, a lot. I love the phrase adultification. In evangelical culture, where a child is asked to make a crisis decision about their faith, going from original sin to being with a heart washed white as snow. There's a psychoanalyst from the 1960s who talked about evangelicals and the way they treat children as something that encourages precocious identity formation. I love that phrase, precocious identity formation. It just think about some of the repercussions of that, such as perhaps adopting a rigid personality structure, a rigid ideology. Maybe it even cuts off certain senses of self-agency, problem solving, a sense of play. I know you talk about play a lot, Ryan. Just some comments there, I guess. I do know that one of the things in the work I do now with authors in the space of growing out of the evangelical style of being religious, which can go inside and outside of more formally designated evangelical communities. I do know that there's this. I'm starting to lose my starting to lose my place here. There's this need to just identify, who am I? That's what it is. There's this, like, I shut down who I was at that age of 5 when I was asked to say the sinner's prayer. And to me, that's what your work gives me hope, is it will help. You mentioned that book, The Whole Brain Child. I'd love to look that up. How do we talk about children developing in ways that are more full? And that's not just in evangelical cultures or quiverful cultures where that is an extreme situation, but it's something in our society as a whole, for sure. And I'd love to see how your work can contribute to that. And I don't know how you would frame some of that, what kind of thoughts come to mind, Ryan, but those are some comments.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. The way that evangelicals treat children when it comes to like conversion and evangelism is is truly remarkable, but not in a good way. Like I've shared this story in the past, but when I was around 4 or 5 too, that was when I accepted Jesus into my heart. And my older brother had just done so himself. And the way it was communicated to me was that since my brother accepted Jesus into his heart, he was going to go to heaven for eternity. And that if I didn't do so likewise, I would be separated from my older brother for eternity. And I don't think I even knew about like hellfire per se at the time, but just the concept of like losing my brother for eternity, like I broke down crying and accepted Jesus into my heart right away. Like, and what's interesting about that story is that like as I got older in evangelicalism, for those who are not familiar with it, like there's a common practice called sharing your testimony, and that's when you like share in front of a group those moments in your life that led you to believe in Jesus and accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And the best testimonies, of course, were always the ones where the people went through the worst things, because they were the most dramatic stories. So the people with the good testimonies, they were the ones that, partied and had mental illness and slept around. They had juicy stories. And I distinctly remember like the first time I shared my testimony, I just literally said what happened, which is what I just told you all now. And when you share in front of a group, basically that you were traumatized into believing Jesus, like it doesn't go over very well. It's pretty uncomfortable. And I realized after the first time sharing my testimony that I had a testimony that somehow didn't fit. It was not conducive to the story that evangelicals wanted. And I mean, I didn't understand at the time, but I understood enough that I should not share my testimony again. And when I look back at that, I just think about like, that's just such a messed up and manipulative thing to teach a child that was just so common and assumed as normal in our culture. And it wasn't just terrifying children, it was terrifying the adults too. Like parents don't want their children to burn in hellfire for eternity either. And so there's a desperation there that makes it so urgent that everyone conforms to the same beliefs. And that's part of what makes those environments so high control, honestly, and is that fear. I think fear is probably one of the most significant motivating factors behind things like, fundamentalism or totalism. These authoritarian high control environments, I think, are ultimately driven by fear. And so I guess that's a good connection to the hope, is that we can overcome that fear of things by like seeing children as actually being capable of addressing the hard points of life. So, the concepts of adultification and parentification are important in making sure that we're not giving children too much too quickly. But at the same time, children are also powerful and creative people who know how to like address and overcome a lot of issues. And the reason for that is that they are just as human as adults. And so I think that that is something that can bring us hope, is knowing that there is a way out, and that children do hold that sort of potential. I think that when we discount children, we are doing, a disservice to the whole world, not just to children or to ourselves.
Thank you.
But yeah, that was good comments, David. Thank you.
I think now is probably a good time. Oh, hang on here. I'm seeing one question coming through in the chat from Heather that you might want to take a look at.
Looking at it. Yeah, so Heather's comment is, coming from the world of advocacy for abused and neglected homeschool children, I'm seeing similar patterns among secular progressive homeschoolers. There's an attitude that abuse and neglect isn't happening in their communities, but out there. Curious if you're seeing that and what the missing piece is from your perspective. I mean, absolutely, like, it's unfortunate, but I would say that, secular and progressive homeschoolers, in my experience, tend to be just as opposed to any form of like government intervention on behalf of abused children as the conservative evangelical homeschoolers. And I think the reason for that is that the whole parental rights movement that was originated with evangelical homeschoolers, it's so pervasive in homeschooling that it has saturated not just the religious homeschool communities, but the non-religious homeschool communities. Part of that, I think, has to do with homeschooling being seen as not just an educational practice, but as a way of life. For many homeschoolers, like, the practice of homeschooling can be as important to those families as religion. Like, it's something that they don't just do, it like defines their entire lives and their personalities. And so there's a lot of fear wrapped up in that, especially when it comes to government intervention. A lot of that fear is coming from the top down, from the leaders in the homeschooling movement. They have more influence politically when they have a more engaged group of people behind them. And so keeping homeschool communities and families afraid of what the government might do is the best way for those leaders and their organizations to stay in power. And I do think that the secular and progressive homeschoolers also have the same issue of seeing abuse being out there as the conservative and evangelicals do. For me, the missing piece is that liberal and progressive homeschoolers are just as reticent to adopt child protection measures as conservative and evangelical homeschoolers. In my experience, like, trying to go to homeschool conventions, like I was, when I wanted to go to homeschool conventions and present on like child abuse awareness, I had equal difficulty getting into the religious ones as the secular or progressive ones. And most secular and progressive homeschool groups I've seen still don't have child protection policies either. So, and that's, of course, these are, child protection policies aren't government. And so that's just something that communities should be doing on their own. So for me, the missing piece is that these communities need to actually care about child abuse and neglect. I don't think they do. I think that if they did, they would be having child protection policies. I think they would be having an annual child abuse awareness day at their homeschool co-op. I think that they would have background checks on the teachers they hire. So I don't see any of that, unfortunately. And so I don't think we're going to see that change until there's a significant amount of people that wake up to this issue. And honestly, I'm not sure what it's going to take to get to that point. There have been so many cases already of abused homeschool children. There's been hundreds. So I'm assuming at some point, like, there will be enough that there will be enough backlash that something will be done. But, I have no idea what that number would be. And it is a bit scary to think about having to wait for that. So I think that if a homeschool community is really progressive, then they should be showing that by actually investing in protecting and empowering the children and their co-ops and such. So
yeah, agreed. I think now is probably a good place for us to end our discussion today. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. If you have additional questions, Ryan's email is on the screen. And yeah, we'll look forward to continuing these discussions in other forums. And I can't wait to read your book, Ryan.
thank you. And thank you again for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everyone.